Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome. But particularly tonight, we usually are associated with some particular division of the institution in which we are this time, mechanical division. But also, I would imagine there are plenty of enthusiasts and amateur restoration people and so on in the audience who've come along to hear what Fiacc has to say. So you're all very welcome. Could I just point out the safety regulations? If in the unlikely event of a fire or other emergency, you all proceed very calmly to the exit you came in, or to the right-hand side there, provided that somebody has the key. That's an exit there. Now, our speaker this evening, Fiacc O'Brolchain, is probably known to most of you looking around the audience. He is an architect, but he has a very strong amateur leaning towards engineering. And apart from his work as an architect, Fiacc has also worked or advised on many small water turbines that are still in operation in Ireland, along with designing some new small hydro stations. However, he has a passion for mechanical restoration, as many of you know, and his subject this evening is no exception. One of his latest achievements, which is the restoration to working order of a 1904 Hornsby Ackroyd hot bulb oil engine, if I have that correct. So it gives me much pleasure to invite Fiacc to present his lecture. Fiacc.
Many thanks, Ron, and thanks for inviting me to give this talk. This is the subject of this evening's talk. It's a 1904 engine that came to Ireland to go to Dockrell's in Delir Street, and they had it. I don't know what they used it for, but very likely they used it for generating electricity until the city's electricity supply became good enough for them to sell it on, which they did in 1913. They sold it to Glencree Reformatory, where it remained ever since. But before we get to talk about it, I'd like to talk a bit about the fairly extraordinary background and development of this engine and this type of engine. It was designed by this man, Herbert Ackroyd Stewart, who was a mechanical engineer born in 1864 in Halifax in Yorkshire, son of Charles Stewart, described as a machinist model maker, and his wife Anne, who was the Ackroyd. He went to Newbury Grammar School in Berkshire and the City and Guilds Technical College in Finsbury, where he assisted in the mechanical engineering department, and later worked in his father's Benchley iron and tin plate works, which he managed after his father's death. But he had various experiments in engineering, and he took out various patents over some years. And then one day in 1885, pretty well as you do, he accidentally spilt oil from a paraffin lamp into a pot of molten tin. The oil vaporized, rose to the lamp, and burst into flame. And he said, that lucky incident, where he didn't take his hand off, gave me a clear insight as to what happens when oil vapor is commingled with air and ignited. Straight away I began to think out a scheme to design an engine to work on oil vapor. Other patents followed which detailed the working of the engine, where air and fuel are introduced separately, and that was the main point of his invention. And also that the combustion chamber and the cylinder were separated by just a very narrow neck, and you can see it here. It's a very poor drawing from a tiny thing, but just here, the piston's at top dead center, and it's here at the very left-hand side of the screen is where the ignition takes place. And other patents went on, and by 1890. The one that made him called improvements in engines operated by an explosion of mixtures of combustible vapor or gas and air. And in its own words it goes, the induction stroke which is the first outward stroke, instead of drawing into the cylinder a mixture of hydrocarbon vapour and air, simply draws in pure atmospheric air. The compression stroke, or first return stroke, compressing this air into a preheated vaporizer. At the desired part of this compression stroke, the supply of liquid hydrocarbon is forced in spray form on a heated vaporizer, which almost instantly changes it into a gas. It combines with the heated air, automatic ignition takes place and propels the piston, which forms the working or second outward stroke. And I mean, pretty well four-stroke engine, but with that difference of the fuel being timed and put in at the right moment and in this separate chamber. And this is the system known as solid injection, which is actually more accurately describes the present day diesel engine and the way it actually operates. Now, at the time, the huge significance of this engine was that there were petrol engines that were before it, and they used carburetors very similar to what we use today. But you couldn't get insurance because the fuel was so volatile that the insurance companies wouldn't have anything to do with stationary engines run on petrol. So this, being a heavy oil engine running on kerosene, wasn't so volatile, wasn't so dangerous, and therefore that's why it was such a success. So the next bit of the story is the two of this man's son. This was Richard Hornsby, and it'd be a name that'd be familiar to anybody who knocks around old engines. Was Hornsby in 1828 he founded a firm as a blacksmithing firm, and they started making steam engines, and they became enormously successful. They pretty well dominated the market for stationary engines for driving threshing machines, and by, as it says there, by 1877, the company was a public company, valued at £235,000 and employing 1,400 workers, managed by his two sons, James and William. And this is what they built: portable engines and traction engines. This is one of their early ones, but they were enormously successful. So Ackroyd had been trying to get somebody to manufacture his engine. He had actually made one of them, and it was in a sanitary works, but it wasn't very well made, and none of Ackroyd's own engines survived. Now, there were only about half a dozen of them. So he approached Hornsby's, and they came to a deal where Hornsby would manufacture the Ackroyd engine under the name Hornsby Ackroyd. And he had quite a job not convincing Hornsby's, but getting somebody to manufacture the Ackroyd engine, because they were all terrified of their own business, the core business being steam engines. So the steam engine manufacturers were afraid of destroying their own works. And in fact, what happened with Hornsby's was that they gave up manufacturing steam engines shortly after this. This is the first two that went on show, and then were sold to the Newport Sanitary Authority in 1890. No, that was the Newport Sanitary Authority. It was 1891. In 1892, this pair, and these two engines, one of them still actually exists. They worked for 30 years in this location, and then one of them was sold to a local Bentley timber merchant, and after 49 years, it was returned to Hornsby's, who had it in the entrance lobby of the Research and Development Department, until a few years ago. It was looked after there by a fellow called Ray Hooley, who's a great Hornsby historian, and it's now in Germany in the Mann Museum, because Mann now own the Ruston business. So this was the revolution in oil engines, and the perfect success, marvelous in its simplicity. No driver, no boiler, no coal, no fire, no steam, no gas, no chimney, no water consumed, no electricity, no ignition tubes, no lamp except for starting. So it was a complete change. You could now suddenly have motive power on demand to drive a machine. You didn't have to send somebody in to start a fire in a steam engine several hours before work started. You didn't have to clean out the tubes afterwards. it's a complete difference. And I just was looking up yesterday that the price of it, 80 pounds to 225 pounds, 2 to 20 horsepower. In today's money, the small one, the 2 horsepower, would cost just under 9,000 pounds, and the big one about 24,000 pounds. So a relatively hefty investment, but like I say, a complete change the way you might work if you're in any sort of manufacturing business. Here's a section drawing of it, and the Ackroyd was always furious at the fact that people called his engines semi-diesels, a term that you'll still hear today, and if he was around he'd probably blast you out of it. But he, to try and get people, to convince people that it wasn't the correct name, he made various bequests to places like University in Western Australia and in Nottingham and the Institution of Mechanical Engineers and so on. And in fact, the income from the bequests is still used for an award on the development of heavy oil engines. So the modern engines still use his constant volume burning in preference to the diesel method for air blast injection with constant burning pressure. So this is it broken down. This is a parts manual, and this page. To get the whole thing ready to run is 165 parts, including all nuts, bolts, and washers. I tried to find out what a modern engine, many parts are in a modern engine of similar size, but I couldn't come up with a satisfactory list. If you want to buy all the extras, you can have an air starter and you can have a set of wheels to turn it around the place, and that'll bring it up to 336 parts, including the toolbox. On the more on the technical side again, there's some nice bits here on the left. Not affected by coal or gas work strikes. Very important. No electrical apparatus liable to get out of order and require constant attention, and so on. So, and on the right-hand side here, you can see this is an illustration section through the hot bulb, and these three illustrations on the top show the arrangement. There's several cones in the side of it, so you can change the compression ratio. Now it's only about 3.5 to 1 with the cones all turned in the way, so I don't know what it is when they're out. Almost nothing. But on the other hand, somebody said to me the other day, if you can get the fuel down the pipe, it'll run. And I've read an account of people in California where they were using one of these to pump oil out of the ground and using the oil unrefined as it came out of the ground, just straight into the engine. So off it goes. And people ask me what it ran on, I said it'd run on milk. Below then is the injector, very simple arrangement, and it's just a piston that just pushes the fuel forward and injects it into the hot bulb chamber. So the really significant Hornsby part was what they did with it. They built the world's first compression ignition loco, this thing for the Woolwich Arsenal. They built over 32,000 of these engines over a period of 23 or 24 years. They produced the world's first tractor, a compression ignition tractor, which, as you can see, owes a lot to the traction engine of the time. I don't know what they used for a clutch, because they would have had to have something, but I don't know what it was. They also produced the world's first fully tracked vehicle. And here's one here with a 10-ton vehicle crossing a ditch on their farm, on their experimental farm. And they sold this idea to what are the company now? The company who became Holt and Company, who became Caterpillar. So they're really significant. I mean, really ingenious in the way that they went about the development and the use of this new type of power. But in 1918, the company was sold, and at that stage it was employing 3,000 people, and it was bought out by Ruston and Proctor and became Ruston and Hornsby, again a familiar name. They also licensed for engines to be built in the States, and in a couple of other places as well. And this is a 125 horsepower single cylinder engine, which is pretty impressive. But I don't know if there's any of them around. But that would certainly make you think when you're starting to start it up in your shed. So anyway, 32,417 of these engines were made by Hornsby's in 26 years. 1,200 a year, which is a pretty considerable operation when you consider it. And they provided electricity for the Taj Mahal, Rock of Gibraltar, and the Statue of Liberty. And Marconi's first transatlantic radio broadcast, not in Ireland but in Cornwall, because Clifton was run on steam. Though there was a station, a duplex station, the first duplex station was in Currywongan, just outside Letterfrack, and I'm not sure that they weren't run on some sort of internal combustion engine anyway. So to finish off on Herbert Ackroyd Stewart, he was described as a courteous and gentleman who never married, somewhat embittered by his lack of recognition of his work. He died of throat cancer in 1927, aged 63, back in Yorkshire, because he had moved to Australia for a time. He directed that all his papers, drawings and models be burnt, but he left money to the Institute of Mechanical Engineers and the Royal Aeronautical Society and the Institute of Marine Engineering, which provided for their respective biannual Ackroyd Stewart prizes, which they still run. It's the Institution of Diesel and Gas Turbine Engineers who have this memorial prize, and they got a cheque for 300 quid for the best paper of the year. And then in 1964, this plaque was put up by the local Archaeological Society in Bensley to mark his centenary. So that's Ackroyd and his engine, and this is where I started. In 2003, I was doing some work up in Glencree, trying to revive their small hydro scheme, and I was searching around looking for the supply pipe, which had vanished and remains vanished. But I opened the door and I saw this thing, and I thought it was painted green, but it was, if you leave anything long enough in a damp place, it'll turn green. And so I took a few photographs, and I've inquired around a bit about it, and it belonged to OPW, as the whole place does. So I wrote to them and said, could I restore it and bring it back up there and put it on show? And nothing happened for a while. But what concerned me was that I thought that if it was going to be left there, it would just be broken up, as so many of them were, and it would just end up as scrap. And what interested me was that it was complete. There was almost nothing missing, except for the injector just there. That was the only thing missing. I thought, well, surely I could find one or make one or cast one or whatever. So it took 3 years before I got a reply. What I did was I wrote to the late David Byers. David was a commissioner in OPW at the time, and thought there's no point in messing around anymore. Use who you know. So I got a phone call from him. He said, "Oh yeah," he said, "I recognise that thing." He said, "I didn't know what you were talking about." He said, "Well, I recognise this item here on the right, which is the governor." And David was a dyed-in-the-wool petrol head. So he said, "Yeah, go ahead." So off we went. That was 3 years later, and we went up to move it. Myself and Peter Stafford here, and I was here, and Tommy Pete. And I found there was a whole load of bits gone off it, and somebody had started to strip it. But I'd made the commitment, so I said, well, we'll keep going. So very small door, big Lumphin engine. How many times have you seen a lintel or a doorpost being taken out by a heavy weight? The flywheel weighs about 3/4 of a ton, I think. So on a February day, myself and Peter and Tommy in the snow, gradually using a garage crane on the inside and Tommy's Hiab on the outside, we moved it out. Luckily, he's a very skilled guy. It's what he does for a living, is move things. So we didn't have too many problems. And So we got everything out and onto the truck, and down as far as my workshop just up the road here in Donnybrook, and got it in there to start the work on it. So it was dirty, very dirty, and where it wasn't covered in oil and grease, it was covered in muck and rust, and some almost impossible to clean. And so I did this. The reverse electrolysis, you get a big bath out in the garden, and your cathode and anode and your battery charger, and keep going around to Donnybrook Fair buying more and more baking soda, pouring it in. It's a wonder I didn't get arrested by the drug squad. And when it gets up to a few amps, it all starts to become a sort of primordial soup. And it's remarkable what it does, and works quite well, and it came up pretty clean in the end, but it was a lot of work. And then this was the only other part I could find that was missing, and had been missing when I went to see it even the first time, was a piston ring. And I was talking to, there was a elderly gent up in Glencree who was the last person to operate. He operated right through the 70s. Whenever the electricity would go out, he'd start it up because it needed to do the milking, and he said it would run the milking machine as long as somebody didn't turn on the kettle, which happened frequently. So, but there was a missing piston ring, and there's a Trinity connection there. They said, oh, somebody from Trinity came up and took that away, and they never came back. So it could be still down in the mechanical engineering department. Not your responsibility, Rob. So this is the cylinder head after cleaning. This is before wire brushing and after cleaning, so you still have a bit of a way to go. And you can see in the back there, you can see the main bearing shells. I had been prepared to do remetalling on bearings, but there was no need. They were all they're perfectly serviceable. And this is the hot bulb on the left, and just above it, the bracket for the two rocker arms, which are just above it again, the blow lamp in the background, and then on the right, the guard for the back of the bottom end of the. So by the time I was finished cleaning it, my overalls would stand up on their own. I had worn out, I don't know how many pretty expensive wire brushes in the angle grinder, but very satisfying to see that lovely below the bracket holding up the governor there in that nice grey of good cast iron. So it really starting to look really well. And on the left there, a rather poor picture of the main bearings, but you can see that they are in good serviceable condition. This is the cylinder on the right, and the big end connecting rod on the left. Mainly the job I had to do was to clean the whole thing, paint it, and reassemble it. We made some bits and pieces, but the main thing we made was we made new nuts and bolts for a lot of it, because those who delve more deeply into the history of mechanical engineering will recall that during the Second War, the Whitworth sizes, the outside of the nut or the head of a bolt, was reduced by one size in order to save metal. And somebody said to me the other day, they just don't look right. So I made mainly quite a lot of new fasteners for it, but almost nothing else. So I started away on the build-up, putting it all together again, and got all the lumps into one piece. And but here you can see on the left-hand side the 4 studs sticking out, and that's where the valve box should be, and I didn't have it. So it was. It lay like that actually for quite a long time, until I talked to a friend of mine, and she suggested that I talk to the Mooney programme. So Brenda Donoghue came down to the workshop and interviewed me, and I went out on RTE with an appeal for the missing parts. And I had no huge expectation, but, well, maybe. Then the following day, 2 days later, I got a message to say that if I went to a certain place, I could pick up all the parts. And there they were. We went and got everything. And we, where are we now? Where I put them all on. So you can see there, you can't actually see the valve box, it is there. And down the bottom then you can see the pump, which all cleaned up very nicely. And it's all starting to look right. And the only part I was missing was the injector, which you can see there. And what happened there was that I went over to the Anson Museum, and Jeff Chandler gave me a block of one that had never been bored out or made, but I had no drawings or anything, and I had no valves, no springs. So eventually, as with all of these types of passions, there is a magazine called Stationary Engine. So I put an ad in Stationary Engine, and very quickly, what's his name, Richard Hopkins got on to me, and he said he had one. And I said, how much do you want for it? And he said, oh, give me the postage. He said, it's going to the right place. So that was great. So fitted it all up and got all the plumbing together. And you can see the exhaust pipe on the left and the cover for the hot bulb to keep it warm after you start up and all that sort of stuff. All ready to roll. So you start fiddling around to see what how it might run, and if it would run, and all of those things. And as one friend of mine said to me, he said, of course it'll run, it's not supposed to do anything else. But so there was various attempts made to get it started until we discovered the knack. And there it goes. And speaking as if I know something. Now, just while I have that still there now for the way that it might operate. On the right hand side, there's two levers you can see, and the upper one there slides the exhaust cam along the shaft, so that on the very bottom of it, you can't really see it there, there's a second cam on the exhaust cam, so you start it on half compression. The lower lever then, again on the right hand side, is for pumping fuel up. Down the bottom, the brass item is the ejector pump with its two non-return valves down those square-headed items, and then the injector up the top with its overflow. When the bar coming down from the top is operated by the governor, and it will open this valve here, and it'll just spill the excess fuel. And there's all. So what do you do when you have one of these things sitting in your workshop? You have a party. So invited all the neighbours and all sorts of strange people, and about 120 or 150 people turned up, and it was Rachel put the ribbon on it, and in spite of appearances, no children were sacrificed to the running of this engine. But so we had a great day out, and then the next obvious thing to do is you go on tour. And this was Shane's Castle in Northern Ireland on a Sunday, and there wasn't that many engines there, and I was wondering what was the reason, and they said, they'll take their irons out on a Sunday, but they won't take their engines out on a Sunday in the rain. So on the Monday there were loads of people, but there was no rain, and it was Monday, and we were nice and near the toilet, so everybody came to see us. So And I met some really amazing people, and learned loads of things as well. I had some reference to a head gasket, and they said, "Oh, you should look at those drawings again. There's no head gaskets on them engines, and you've got the flywheel on the wrong side," and all sorts of stuff like that. So we went to Monalty, and this one we went to Stradbally, and ran it there. And at that stage I was getting cocky enough that people would ask me, said, "Is that thing difficult to start?" And I'd say no and stop it. And I'd say, "Oh no, don't stop it," and then start it again. And it runs better when you put it on full compression. Come on, you idiot. Watch now. That's it. Much better. So that's more or less it. There are a number of people I'd really like to thank, because it was quite an adventure. Friend Ross Galbraith is here, and Declan Byrne, who said, "Yeah, go on, do it," you know. David Byers, obviously, the late David Byers, who gave me the permission, and Dermot O'Brien, who works with them also in OPW. Tommy, who did the lifting, and Sean Cullen, who found the lathe that I did the work on a ship that was about to go for scrap. Local mechanic Tim Murphy gave me a garage crane for using for lifting lumps around the place. And Rachel, who put up with the whole thing, and Brendan Donoghue and Derek Mooney of RTE, who got the bits, and last and certainly not least, Peter Stopford, who gave me lots of help and advice and was my teammate on the whole project. Well, there it is. Thank you. If you have any questions. Yeah.
Well, Fiacc, I don't know about you, I found that fascinating. Never having got my hands dirty on restoring anything, but the patience is a virtue, and the patience and the enthusiasm goes into making something like that come alive. I really think was fascinating, and thank you, Fiacc, for volunteering to come along and talk to us about that. Now, I don't know whether amongst the enthusiasts in the audience whether there are any technical questions that Fiacc might possibly be embarrassed by, but please do, anybody have a question?
Fiacc,
Yes, sir.
Really non-technical. Where's the engine at the minute? Is it in your workshop still?
It's not in my workshop. OPW. It was in fact down in what's his name's stud farm for a while. What's the name of the place? Gilligan's stud farm for a while, but it's currently in Inchcore in OPW store there, and the plan is that it will go to Castletown House, where they're going to restore the stable block, and hopefully we'll put it in there in a line shaft and maybe a couple of appropriate bits of machinery and run it every now and again, because it shouldn't having done that, it should be working.
How many are there of this type of engines in existence or working?
Oh, there'd be a good number. Not so many of this size. The problem, what I reckon would happen with the development of this engine is that every year they would get the same power out of an engine that was smaller and smaller and smaller. So it wasn't, by the time they were finished making these things, they were, a 10 horsepower engine was this size, instead of an enormous thing. And there are a good number of Blackstone engines knocking around, all right, because they were very popular. So a little bit later, there's one out in Skerry's Mills, but there's few enough big ones around the country. A lot more in the UK, obviously.
Questions?
If motors around there, what weight is the engine actually? What weight is that particular engine?
I think it's about 2.5 tons.
So it's not terribly transportable.
No, hence the dirty great 4-wheel trailer that we bought somewhere in County Westmeath, and I used to have to bum various 4-wheel drive vehicles for towing it here and there, and no, it's not really portable. Would be an exaggeration.
Did the OPW provide any funds?
Well, the thing was that they offered to. David said, whatever, don't worry about cost and so on. And I didn't really feel, well, because of the missing parts, I wasn't 100% sure that I would ever manage to finish it, which was a bit of a concern. But in the end, I got them to pay. They did pay for all the materials, and in fact, they paid for the trailer as well, because I think the trailer was probably the most expensive part of the whole thing, wasn't it?
Did Dave Byers get to see it before he died?
No, unfortunately, no. That was very sad for David, because he was a very good supporter and so on,
Was there any other hot bulb engines, or were they the only manufacturers of?
Oh no, I think there was quite a number. I mean, Bollanders are hot bulbs, and they.
Union made hot bulbs.
Yeah, a lot of the early ones. It was quite quick before they moved over. I mean, nearly all the Blackstones are magnetos, haven't they? I think they do, and so there was quite quickly they moved. I don't know why. I think because you could probably get a lot more power. The compression ratio on a hot bulb engine is, poor.
And an idea that in Tubman the ESP had a hot bulb engine in it, but it was vertical.
Yes,
I'm sure that
I don't know. In fact, I was reading an article the other day where they were talking about manufacturing them for the third world because they're so simple. You can just, and there are, if you do dig around on websites, you'll find them. There's a guy in Iran somewhere who has acres of them, and there's some of them still working on the edges of the desert, providing water here and there, and an enormous number of them went second hand to Australia for the very obvious reason that these were bought and they were used for small electrical schemes for towns and villages all over the place, and whenever they were finished with them, off they went to the next place, and the next place was off in Australia because again it was sort of semi-developed and there was never going to be a grid. So
To be fair, how do you keep the hot bulb hot? Or do you only need to heat the
you just heat it. Well, it keeps itself warm after that, and there's a little lid on the sort of a shroud over the bulb, and you take a lid off that so that the burner can get enough air. And once it's finished, you just pop the lid back on, and it'll stay running, even running quite slow. It won't. It's quite happy.
Is the cover hot enough to fry your ashes?
No, it is. Yeah. You could, yeah. And when I was running it at the
Has lots of uses.
yeah, when I was running it at the in Shane's Castle and Stradbally and so on, you can just see in the background there. It's an old Cosin gas cylinder provided by a friend of mine who used to work for Cosin Gas, and that it would take the full day to boil that. At the end of the day, starting and stopping, that the water in that would be boiling. So if you wanted to run it under load or anything, you'd have to provide a slightly bigger.
I see that in the original sketch there.
The original one, yeah, much more.
10 foot or more.
Yeah. And they also say in the manual that if it's over 30 horsepower, it takes 2 men to start it.
I read that you could run these on creosote, they might not have fuel. So what are you trying to running this on?
Yeah, I ran it on kerosene, which is what it's supposed to run on. But like I said, it run on almost any old thing. And I meant to look up the definition of heavy oil because it's an ignition. It's
Whiskey wouldn't be heavy enough, would it?
I'd say whiskey. I'd say it'd run on whiskey. You'd probably have to dilute. No, almost any other.
How long did you heat the bulb for to get it going?
About 10-15 minutes. Yeah.
and then give it one swing. And
Well, that's what we learned. I didn't do it, but we learned how to start it. We tried several times. I actually have a video of Ross there. We're trying to get it over top dead centre, and it just won't do it, you know. And we learned after a while you prime it with plenty of fuel, and you turn it backwards, and switch off it you go. And it'll explode backwards and just push, and that'll be enough to get it over top dead centre the next time, and off it'll run. And we had to learn that the hard way. And then loads of people say, "Did you not know that?"
Any other questions?
The initial thing that you had there when you said vaporising oil just reminds me of the early tractors.
Yeah. TVO track, yeah.
Diesel was what it's meant very like.
Yeah, well, it's a similar principle, as it were. You start at one, and once it gets warm, it'll run on the other.
Did you ever run it overload?
No, never found something. And I was looking around, and it was up in Shane's Castle and so on, and various people said, "Oh, the obvious thing would be a big DC dynamo," but I don't like DC at that size, so I never did. No, I've been looking around on behalf of OPW as we do a line shaft. There's loads of things you can get. There's you can even get a washing machine, and obviously things like things for bruising oats or whatever, But there's all sorts of machines you could run off it. So I think could be a bit of fun actually. That.
Dyson eat your heart out.
Exactly. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Why is it offered with very low compression ratios?
I think for different fuels, Matthew, as far as I can make out, yeah. But why I don't really know. I say, like I say, in case you only had milk, or you're like our friend in California with running his oil pump.
And you never had any problem with it travelling up or?
No, didn't.
Kerosene is very
None of that. No, it runs really clean and absolutely no problem at all. You saw a bit of smoke there at the start, starting it up, but once you put it onto full compression and so on, run absolutely clean. No difficulty at all.
I remember an old TVO tractors would get half compression or full compression.
Yeah.
What was the condition of the board and the piston?
They were very good. They were really excellent. Now, I don't know how after such a long period of time. I suspect that it was because it was probably well cared for, and it probably wasn't used all that much. There was a story that had been used in Glencree for running a line shaft for teaching the kids to make shoes. But I didn't find any evidence of that. There wasn't anything up there. I knew obviously that it ran the electrical, it was an emergency generator. But we actually did replace the rings. The Bradford Piston and Ring Company supplied 3 rings for 150 quid or something. So I still have the 2. The original rings are most extraordinary because they're eccentric in that the outside ring and the inside, the ring is thicker at the back from the gap than it is at the front. So they're actually kind of like tapered. Most extraordinary. I was going to mount one of them and give it to David as a present, but there you go.
Yeah, how are the bearings?
Very good. How are they lubricated?
How are they lubricated?
There's the bearing, the big end and the bore have lubricators on them with glass tubes, and then the main bearings have 2 little cups with wicks in them, and so you just fill those and leave them to their own devices, and they naturally enough I'd be kind of more than generous with the oil. You'd be a little bit nervous of wearing it out.
So how often will somebody, if it was say when it was running in Glencree or when they were running all the time, so how often would you have to go and top up the oil or?
Well, the whole base of it is a fuel tank, which I didn't use. That's why I used the jerry can, which is around the back of it there, which is more than enough to run it for a day or two. But that whole base there is a fuel tank. I don't know how much it would take, 50, 60 gallons, probably run it for a week.
well, 50, 60 gallons, just trying to work out how much that would weigh. I was just thinking of
Quarter ton.
it,
Quarter of a ton?
or something
Yeah,
to add to the weight of
Yeah, yeah,
the thing. There's a consideration if it was
Yeah.
on the floor. Then.
that's true, yeah.
Okay. Well, certainly, I think I speak for the rest of you, but very appreciative to Fiacc for addressing us this evening. How an architect can be so expert at restoring engines, I don't know. Maybe he should have done mechanical engineering and then become an architect. But
Might
anyway.
reflect on my architecture.
Well, not many buildings are getting built while he's restoring engines anyway. So thank you very much indeed for that presentation. It was well worth coming along to hear it. And good luck with the next project, whenever that might be. So, yeah.
Thank you, Rob. Great stuff. Thanks a million.
There'd be, of course, ample opportunity in the bar downstairs to continue any discussions you might have with Fiacc. But just to say that our next event is the 21st of November. It's a Monday, 6:30. And the presentation will be, traditionally, we have one session which is on conservation, building conservation, rather than engine conservation. And the subject, the topic, is the restoration and conservation of Ireland's last hidden, in inverted commas, 18th century, I'll read it again, 13th century urban church for reuse as a museum. And we're talking about St. Mary's Church in Kilkenny, which has been totally restored and converted for reuse as their one of their main archaeological museum in Kilkenny. So you can get full details of that, of course, on the web, on the Engineers Ireland website. And the evening will be in association with the Structures and Construction Division and indeed the Institution of Structural Engineers from the UK, at least the Republic of Ireland branch of that. So we hope for a fairly full attendance there. So thank you for coming and safe home. Thank you.